Hello, everybody. It's January 29th, Friday, 2021. Today's episode of Civil War Chat is General Lee and the Freedmen's Bureau. It's triggered by an article written by Professor Toni Locy of the journalism school at Washington and Lee University, which she put into The Nation magazine, I think last July 2020. Basically a polemic against Robert E. Lee and an argument to remove his name from the school. So let me pull up my notes. I'm going to just, I want to address specifically the remarks she makes about the Freedmen's Bureau and the relationship between the Freedmen's Bureau and the residents of Lexington, Virginia, and Washington College, into another, and she also puts in there VMI, which was also located in Washington, in Lexington, Virginia in 1865. So to begin, Locy reserves special criticism of Lee's boys, as she calls them, for their dislike of the Freedmen's Bureau, which she falsely implies was chiefly due to white opposition to black education. In truth, the Bureau was as much a stalking horse for enabling radical Republicans to create party-loyal puppet regimes in the former Confederate states as it was an instrument for black education. Its schools only served about 10% of the entire South's black school-aged children. Moreover, the schools provided two forms of education. One was Republican Party propaganda, designed to transform the ex-slaves into a reliable GOP voting bloc. The other encompassed the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, Southerners objected not to the latter, but they objected to the former. They objected to the GOP propaganda education, the indoctrination that the Freedmen's Bureau schools provided for that. Now, according to Black historian W.E.B. Du Bois, the Bureau dispersed $20 million over its 9-year life, of which only about $6 million, 30%, was for education. In another program that totaled $8 million and yielded $1,600 per beneficiary, where even Du Bois concedes, quote, fraud was frequent, close quote. The Bureau awarded 5,000 former black soldiers $8 million for enlistment bounties that they allegedly had not previously received. In other words, when they volunteered to join the Union Army during the Civil War, they were supposed to collect bounties. Well, 5,000 of them said they never got their bounties, and they collected $8 million for it, an average of $1,600 per recipient. By comparison, Robert E. Lee's salary as president of Washington College was only $1,500 annually. A week after the radical Republican Congress refused to seat any Southern congressmen or senators elected under President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction Plan in December 4th, 1865, that's when they rejected, would not give them the seats, the Bureau sent an agent to Lexington, Virginia, to open a school and to displace civil authority with Freedmen's Bureau rule. This was a week after the Southern elected representatives have been denied their seats in Congress. This guy shows up from the Freedmen's Bureau in Lexington, Virginia, where Washington College is and where VMI is. By the middle part of the next year, which is, say, July 1866, Du Bois, the Black historian, admits that the Freedmen's Bureau had become a near dictatorial power throughout the South, regardless of the rulings of local courts or the laws of local authorities. To quote Du Bois, the government of the unreconstructed South was thus put very largely in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau, especially as in many cases, the department military commander was now made also an assistant commissioner of the Bureau. It was thus that the Freedmen's Bureau became a full-fledged government of men. It made laws, executed them, and interpreted them. It laid and collected taxes, defined and punished crime, maintained and used military force and dictated such measures as it thought necessary and proper for the accomplishment of its varied ends. Moreover, the Freedmen's Bureau of Justice was not colorblind. It had its own military court system, which replaced all civil courts. This meant that private citizens were tried under military justice, guilty until proven innocent, no writ of habeas corpus, no jury, no records of the proceedings. Simultaneously, Bureau men had done all in their power to alienate Southern blacks from Southern whites, which should have been their primary job. Nonetheless, instead, they organized the blacks into local chapters of the Union League for the purpose of corralling ex-slaves into the Republican Party. When the Civil War ended, the Republican Party was barely 10 years old. It might have been strangled in its cradle if the readmittance of the Southern states into the Union failed to be managed in a way to prevent Southerners from allying with Northern Democrats to regain control of the federal government. If the Southern states came back into the Union and submitted Democrats and were represented by new Democrats in the Senate and the House, they would have broken the veto-proof majority that the Republican Party had in those two seats. Thus, the infant GOP's solution required that most readmitted Southern senators and congressmen be Republicans. They had to adopt a plan that would ensure that. That meant that vassal governments needed to be established in the South. However, since the Constitution required that states elect their own representatives, Republicans needed a way to limit the number of Southern Democrat voters while simultaneously increasing the number of Republican ones. Since there were few white Republicans in the region, the party needed to create a new constituency. Consequently, they settled on two objectives. First, mandatory black suffrage in all former Confederate states, but not northern states. They expected that such a mostly illiterate and inexperienced electorate could be manipulated to consistently support Republican interest and to hate their former masters. Second was to disfranchise the Southern white classes most likely to oppose Republican policies. When the Bureau representative that Professor Locy cites showed up in Lexington in December 1865, the adjoining state of Maryland had already taken away the vote from former Confederates. In other words, Maryland had a number of citizens that fought with the South during the Civil War, and when the war was ended and they went home, they did not have the right to vote. Furthermore, a number of leading Washington Republicans were trying to get Congress to confiscate the lands of white ex-Confederates and distribute them to blacks through the Freedmen's Bureau. Among such men were the two most prominent party leaders, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner and Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens. Those two men, more than any others, shaped Republican Reconstruction after the war. Given that most of the Lexington area residents were white farmers, they realistically feared at the time that this agent showed up in December 1865 that the Bureau was intent upon seizing their lands if the radical Republicans could override the anticipated vetoes by President Johnson. The worry was especially acute for Washington College students, many of whom were former Confederate soldiers. The two goals were accomplished by the Republicans by the 1867 Reconstruction Acts. Passed over President Johnson's vetoes, they paved the way for the 14th Amendment in 1868. The acts required that all former Confederate states write new state constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage, even if they denied voting rights to former Confederates. Blacks were also freely allowed to vote for delegates to the state constitutional conventions. In other words, blacks were also permitted to vote for delegates to the conventions that would write those constitutions. Each government formed by such constitutions, as required by the Republican Congress, each of the state governments must also ratify the 14th Amendment before it could be readmitted. Blacks thus became the majority of voters in Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Arkansas and Tennessee were kept in the Republican column by denying the vote to ex-Confederates. Virginia Republicans attempted to follow Tennessee and Arkansas in 1869 when they submitted their so-called Underwood Constitution for a statewide referendum. In other words, Virginia Republicans wanted also to create a vassal regime. Blacks of Virginia would get the vote. The percentage of the population in the state was not as great as it was in, say, South Carolina or Mississippi, where blacks accounted for over half of the population. It was not so high in Virginia. So therefore, the Republicans of Virginia said, well, what we're going to do is not only give the votes to the blacks, we are going to take the vote away from former Confederate soldiers. So this Underwood Constitution required black suffrage, but it also disfranchised former Confederates. Now, when it came up in early 1869, Robert E. Lee and other Virginia leaders asked that the newly elected President Ulysses Grant allow Virginia's voters to vote separately on the Underwood Constitution, which was a Republican document and mandating black suffrage, and separately on the disfranchisement provision that would take the vote away from the ex-Confederates. Grant said, okay. Thus, the Virginia leaders agreed that they would support and favor the Underwood Constitution per se if Grant would allow the state's voters to vote separately on whether ex-Confederates should lose their voting rights. Grant agreed, and the Virginia voters adopted a black suffrage constitution. The white Virginia voters, along with the black, adopted by a large majority a black suffrage constitution, but it stripped out the Confederate disfranchisement provision, thereby keeping the vote for the ex-Confederate soldier. Thus, it was white Virginians voluntarily gave blacks the right to vote in exchange for letting the ex-Confederate soldier also have the right to vote. It seemed like a fair exchange. Not some evil, nefarious thing that, these evil white Southerners did. No, this was not nefarious at all. It was white Southerners, the white Virginians said, we were going to approve by an overwhelming majority this Constitution that gives blacks the right to vote, so long as we get to vote separately on whether or not the provision that denies the vote to ex-Confederates is voted separately. And they voted that one down. So fair's fair. Blacks got the right to vote. Ex-Confederates got the right to vote in Virginia. And this was done, General Lee played a leading role in this. In sum, Professor Locy's citation of John McClure's Freedmen's Bureau and General Lee's Boys essay is seriously false. Her citation of that essay is seriously false. First and foremost, it implies that Southern whites objected to the Bureau because they hated blacks on a purely racial basis. That is false. In reality, the whites' chief complaint was that the Bureau often promoted a political agenda designed to penalize former Confederate soldiers of every rank by taking away their right to vote, their right to hold office, and simultaneously confiscating their lands, taking their lands away to redistribute to blacks and well-connected white carpetbaggers. That confiscation plan was rejected before the formation of the Underwood Constitution, but it was hotly debated and it was very uncertain at the time when the Freedmen's Bureau representative showed up in Lexington, whether it would in fact take effect or not. Okay, let's go on. Second, the Locy McClure allegations of sexual abuse of blacks by white men in Lexington fails to consider that the Bureau itself may have considered the claims frivolous. The Bureau, after all, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, black historian, had the authority to overrule the findings of any local court and could initiate a military tribunal on their own authority of any alleged crime, which they often did throughout the South. But in Lexington, they didn't do that. Not for these allegations of sexual abuse that Locy cites. The Freedmen's Bureau itself apparently said, we're not going to do this. Why? Maybe there was nothing to the allegations. Something that Locy does not consider. She just does not consider it, despite the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau was heavily invested in getting blacks to line up and vote in the Republican Party line. Third, Locy fails to mention that white conflicts with the Freedmen's Bureau in Lexington became minimal, vanished almost, once the 1869 Constitution that gave voting rights to blacks and former Confederates was passed, which Lee had urged. Lee got that done. Locy really ought to thank Lee for what he did, as opposed to castigating him for imagined offenses and, oh gosh, who knows? Look, what so much about the Freedmen's Bureau is misunderstood. It's just commonly assumed by people that hear it, oh, the Freedmen's Bureau was great, it was there to help blacks, blah, blah, blah. There's no revelation, there's no discussion with people like Locy of the fact that it had a political agenda, and that it had dictatorial power. It could overrule any local court in Lexington or anywhere else in the South. So if there were rapes going on, and the local courts said no, this wasn't a rape, the Freedmen's Bureau could have overruled it. Easy. They did it all the time. And the rest of the, to get these facts, you need to get these facts, especially now that there's so much talk of taking Lee out of the name of Washington and Lee. You need to get these facts. One way is to read my books. Get this one. Ulysses Grant's Failed Presidency by Philip Lee. It's $22. It's $20 on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, $25 if you want an autographed copy from me. If you want that, write me. Phil, P-H-I-L _ Lee, L-E-I-G-H @me.com. Okay, same thing. Southern Reconstruction, $22 at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, $25 if you want it autographed by me. Here in the States, I pay the postage for both of these books. But gosh, please get these books. Get yourself, we all need to get educated. We need to understand what the Freedmen's Bureau was, what the Union Leagues were in the South. We need to understand there was a political agenda. That dislike of the Freedmen's Bureau by the white Southerners was not primarily racially motivated. It was motivated against the dictatorial powers of the Freedmen's Bureau and agendas like confiscating the lands of the Confederate soldiers, taking their lands away after they just spent 4 years living in near starvation to defend their homeland, taking away their right to vote, giving blacks the right to vote, which they did in Virginia. The white Southerners voted that in overwhelmingly in 1869. We need to get our story. These facts need to come out. If we're going to really provide a true analysis of what Reconstruction was about to people that want to tear down monuments and icons like Robert E. Lee, they need to know the truth, and we need to tell them these books are going to help you do it. Get them. Okay, that's our show. So thanks for watching.